my name is Chetan and welcome to the module 3 of my training program. Um, so, so if you see here, okay, in the project, in the first project, right, we learned about the basics of Java, data types, arrays, what do you mean by typecasting, then different operators in Java, then what are loops, what are statements, and what do you mean by methods specifically, right? Now, in module 3, we gonna learn Java OOPS concept basically. For example, what do you mean by class? What is object, right? What are global versus local variables? How do you create objects in Java? Then what do you mean by instance variable and methods? Heap utilization. Then what is a static method? Why we need that? And what are constructors, right? So this is the plan for module 3. Okay, so let's get started. Now what I'm going to do here, I will create altogether a separate Java project. Okay, so just right click in this area, okay, and just say new Java project. Okay, or there's other way around to it. You can also go to this menu items file, just say new Java project. Okay, and you can just give a name as module 3 and 4. Okay, because we're gonna learn module 3 and 4 in the same Java project, so I'm just naming it as module 3 and 4. Okay, and just say this is oops, okay, Java oops concept, and just say finish, right? So as we discussed in the module 1 itself, right, whenever you create a module or whenever you create a project in Eclipse, okay, of course that will be created under this workspace whatever you have created, right? So how do you check that? So just right click on your project and just say properties. Okay, so if you see here, this is the path where my project is present, right? And this is the workspace basically, right? So this workspace is currently having two projects, module 1 to Java introduction and module 3-4 oops, right? Okay, now guys, I'll create a package and I'll give the package name as class object. Okay, we're gonna learn that what do you mean by class, what do you mean by object, right? Okay, now what is a class in Java? What is a class, right? So class is nothing but, guys, it's a template. So let's understand the definition first, right? So class is nothing but a template or a design, or it is also known as blueprint, or it is also known as skeleton. Okay, so class is a template or a design or a blueprint or a skeleton of a logical entity in this world, right? So what are those logical entities and what do you mean by template or design or a blueprint or a skeleton? For example, guys, let's say we know that car, we all know that something called as car, right? Now whenever we say a car will have certain design basically, or a template or a blueprint, right? For example, whenever I say some BMW car to any person, he would imagine that okay, the car would have name, right? Then the model name, right? It would have wheels, then it would, of course, a car would start, car would stop, car would run, car will have mileage, right? So this the structure of a car basically is defined by a class entity, or rather a class in Java, right? So similarly, guys, you something called a student again is also a class, right? Then maybe hospital is also a class in Java, right? It will have some structure. For example, hospital will have OPD, IPD, reception. So the the entity details are defined by class structure basically in Java, right? So let me show that through example. So let me right click on this package. Okay, now of course, how do you create a class? So just right click on either source or this package. So if you right click on source, it will be created under default package. I want to create it in a specific package, so I'm gonna right click on this package and just say new and class basically, right? So I'm creating a class with the name called as car basically, right? So if you see, public class car gets created. We had already created class examples in the previous module itself, but now we are actually learning what is class. Okay, now this car, as I said, car class has of course state and behavior, right? State and something called as behavior, right? So for example, a car will have a name, right? It will also have model number, model. Okay, then car will also have something called as wheels count, right? Then when you come to behavior, guys, okay, so behavior as in a car can start, right? So behavior of your class basically is defined by something called as instance method or a static method, right? So I'll say static, public static void start, right? Then let's say you have public static void, let's say stop, like this, right? Sorry, let's create the instance method, sorry. Right? And let's say I also have a method public void, let's say mileage, right? So if you see, car is a class, okay, which has state and behavior, right? State is defined by variables, okay, also known as instance variable, whereas behavior is defined by instance methods basically, right? Now, so the way, so this is nothing but a design basically, a template or a skeleton or a blueprint of a car class basically, right? Similarly, guys, I can also have another class, right? For example, I can create a student class as well. Let's say student, right? Again, the student, guys, will have some structure or design. Let's say I'll say student will have a name, right? It will be having a roll number, right? Or maybe school name, right? Like this. And so this is a state, right, of a student class, and these variables called as instance variables, correct? Whereas what is the behavior? So for example, student can eat, student can walk, student can play, right? And so on and so forth, right? So I'll say, for example, public void, let's say dress code, right? All students will have dress code basically, right? So let me add a sys out here. Okay, so student, let's say dress code, correct? Then as I said, all student they eat basically, right? So I'm gonna say here student eat, like this. Okay, all of them gonna study as well, like this. So study is a method. Again, I'm gonna do sys out, let's say student study, right? So if you see, this is a state and you have a behavior. So behavior is defined by here instance methods, right? Now let's move on. Now guys, the variables which we declared at class level are called as global variables, right? Now since these are instance variable, so I'm going to say these are global instance variable basically, right? And these are methods basically, right? Instance methods. Now now how do you create, just a second, so let me add just some sysout methods here, so that, right? Now guys, in so you have understood this is a car class, this is a structure or design, right? Now how do you create an object of this particular class, or how do you create an instance of this particular class car, right? So just say main, so we need a main method basically, and in this method I'm gonna write down something called as new car, guys. Okay, so this line itself creates a object of car class basically, right? So if I just open, if I show this pictorially, okay, so when I write a new of car, so on your heap basically, so heap is nothing but a memory, right? So on your heap, so let's say this is my heap, one block gets created, okay, this block gets created. Now whenever you say new car, let's say if I say new car two times, so of course it is creating two objects, right? So on your heap two blocks will be created, right? Now what will be there on these blocks, right? So when I say new of car, for example, let's say, so just understand this new car itself is creating an object. Now when I say car c1 equals to new of car, it means, guys, I have created a reference which is pointing to this object basically, right? So I've created a reference with the name of, let's say, c1, right? And this reference, guys, okay, it's pointing to this particular object on your heap, right? So if I just create an object without a reference, of course I cannot access it, right? So if you see the second block, there's no reference, so there's no way I can access it, right? So this c1 is a reference which is pointing to this object on your heap basically. Understood, right? So we never write something like this, because this means that we're just creating an object but there's no reference to it, right? So I'll just, so for your reference I'll just say this line creates the object, but there is no reference to it, right? So here again, this line creates the object and c1 is the reference pointing to it basically, right? So without reference we cannot access an object. Now let's move on. Okay, now whenever you create an object, guys, okay, this object will hold all the instance variable and instance methods basically, meaning, okay, so on this block you will have name, okay, then you will have model, wheels count, okay, then you have start, stop, okay, and let's say mileage, right? In between you are having mileage, right? This is the method. So whenever you create a object, okay, a block gets created on your heap and all the instance data members of your class basically will be assigned on this block basically. Now, of course, the values will be default. For example, if it's a string, the value will be null. These are the default values which will be assigned by your JVM, right? So, like wheel count is 0. If it's a in numeric, it will be 0. If it's if it's a string, it will be null basically, like that. Okay, so let me see this as just a second. Okay, this is nothing but your heap basically, right? Similarly guys, I have created this object as well. So again, whatever values I was having here, again those will be initialized on this block as well, right? For example, null, then you have wheels count equals to 0, then you have start, okay, then you have mileage, okay, and then you have stop basically, right? So we can create any number of objects in my program, right? So as in when you create objects, those blocks will be created on your heap, right? Now guys, let's say I have two objects. Now this time I'm saying this is my C2, okay, the reference to access this particular object is C2. Now keep this in mind, right? So so in short, basically when we create object, we are creating the multiple copies of it, right? So now this C2 can access its own stuff. So C2 can access its own stuff, C1 can access its own stuff. They are not at all related with each other, right? So for example, if I say sys out, let's say C1 dot name, and if I print this, execute this program, you would see a value called as null is getting printed right on the console. Why? Because if you see, when I create an object, the values are not yet initialized, right? Your JVM will give values as default values. So name is a string, so it will have a null value, right? Then if I try to print model or maybe a wheels count, again it will have the default value, right? And that will be 0 because it's integer, right? So it is very important to initialize the values first. Whenever you create an object, the values should be initialized. So I'm going to say here, let's say c1 dot name equals to, let's say, BMW, right? Then I'll say c1 dot model, let's say I'll say x700, right? Then I'll say c1 dot wheels count equals to 4, right? And then guys, if I try to print this, okay, you would see now it is printing BMW and wheel count is 4 basically. Of course I haven't written for model, right? So what is happening here in this picture? Now I have set this value name, I have set it to basically BMW, then model I have set to X700, wheels I have set to 4. Now this C1 can very well read the values, and this instance method can very well take the advantage of this instance variable in this method, right? So for example guys, let's say I'll say here car started, okay, and let's say what is the car, it is name, right? So I'm gonna just stopped like this, let's say plus name plus, let's say, model. What was the model, like this, okay, plus, let's say, I'm sorry, one second. So plus, let's say, having wheels, okay, wheel count 4, like this, okay. So if you see guys, okay, I have set the variables. Now I can very well utilize them in these methods. These are instance method, right? Instance method can very well access the instance variables, like this, okay, just a second. Stopped, and let's say I'll say name, like this, okay. And now if I see guys, now these are the instance methods, right? So of course if I want to access this instance method, Again, I need a reference to access them. So I have already created a reference C1. So I'm going to simply say here C1 dot start, then C1 dot mileage, and then C1 dot stop, right? And if I execute them, guys, you'll see here, see now it's saying car stopped, car started, BMW, then the model is so and so, Wales is this, mileage of BMW and so, right? So I have set the instance variables, and then these instance methods can very well access this instance method in them basically, right? Understood? Right. Now, now we can do the same stuff for a student class, right? So for example, I have a main method. Okay, let's say I'm creating student s1 equals to new of student, like this. Now in this case, guys, as I said, whenever you create an object, what happens on your heap basically. So let me show you another example. So on your heap, guys, a block gets created, right? Now what is a reference here basically? So if you see, I have created a reference with the name of what, guys? S1, right? Now whenever you create an object, as I mentioned, what will go on this block? So all the instance variables and your instance method will reside on this block, right? So let's say name. Now what will be the default value? It's a string, so the default value will be null. Then you have roll number. Now roll number is an integer, so the default value will be 0. Then you have school name. Again, it will be null, right? Then guys, okay, then you guys have dress code, right? Then you have eat, okay, and then you have study, right? So I can keep creating n number of objects. So the way I created S1, I can also create S2, S3, S4, and so. So your heap would of course consume memory, right? Now, so the very first thing what we have to do here is we have to initialize the values, right? As in we need to give the name, roll number, school, and then these methods can very well access these variables in them basically, right? So for example, now I'm going to say here, let's say the s1 dot name, let's say the name is Virat, right? Let's say the roll number is 10, okay, and let's say s1 is school name is, let's say, Bishop, right? Then so let's say dress code, I'm gonna say here school, let's say name, and I'll say here, just a second, dress code is white and blue, let's say, like this, something I'm trying to do it, right? Eat. So I'm gonna say here the name here, right? So I'll say name like this, okay, student, let's say 80, okay, and then I'll say here, guys, roll number, okay, student is studying, like this, okay. Just some, I'm just trying to show you some examples here, that these are the instance variable, these are the instance method. So instance method, guys, can very well access the instance variable, okay. So if you see here, now I've created a s1 object, okay, I've set the values, initialized the values of the instance variable, and I can simply say here now, guys, if you see dress code, okay, then eat, then let's say study, right? And if I call them, see, you would see, guys, so Bishop dress code is white, blue, okay, I did a spell mistake. Then Virat student is eating, right? When your JVM goes here, basically it's gonna say here name, which I have set over here. So Virat student eating, like that. Okay, understood? Okay. Now guys, okay, let me talk about what is a difference between a instance versus static now. Okay, this is very interesting. Okay, now if you see guys in this example, okay, if I keep creating objects like this, let's say I created student 2, okay, then I create a student 3, student 4, like this, right? I keep creating objects here, right? Now if you notice one thing here, of course, whenever I create an object, all basically your all your instance variables will reside on this object, right? Like here I'll be having a name, right? For example, I'll be having a name, then I'll be having, let's say, roll number, then school name, right? Dress code, eat, study, right? Again, for this object also, all instance variable and methods will be assigned on your object, right? On your heap. So let's say name, roll number, right? Then you have school name, then you have dress code, eat, and study, basically, right? So this is a thumb rule that whenever you create an object, right? So on your heap, all the instance variable and your instance methods will be allocated basically with respect to that object. But if you see one thing carefully, guys, okay, in this case, we know that school name of all the student is same here, right? Whereas again, if you see the dress code of all the students which belong to this specific school is also same, right? So so although the school name and the dress code is same here, but we are unnecessarily spending memory while creating objects, right? So let's say if you have created 5 objects here, so all five so for all 5 objects you are unnecessarily spending the memory of on your heap, right? So what I'm going to do here now, so whichever stuff is common to a object, whichever stuff is common to a object, I'm going to define that as a static, right? So now guys, I will go to my, let me create a package first, new package, right? I'll create, let's say, b instance versus static, right? So as I mentioned here, okay, let's say I have a car class. Again, I'll create the same example, car, or a student, right? So in case of a, I was talking about student, sorry, so let me create student, right? So if you see for a student, guys, now I know that school name and dress code, these are constant, right? These are common, right? I know eat and study is also common, but just to differentiate over here, I'll take, let's say, school name and dress code is common to all the objects. So if you see here now, guys, I'm gonna see here string name, right? So name of the student will be different. Whereas, guys, if you see, I'm gonna define now, let's say, static school name equals, let's say, Bishop, right? Whereas, guys, like this, okay, just a second, string like this. Whereas public void, let's say, all student they have, let's say, certain standard, right? The standard will be different for each student, so I'll define it as instance method. So sys out, let's say, print standard, like this, okay, right? Whereas the trace code method, I'm going to define it as, guys, static, because I know that dress code will be common for all the student, right? So I'll say here dress code, okay, and this is of course a static method, okay. this is also static. So just while printing, we'll see how they are getting called, right? So if you see guys, now in this class I have two types of variable, right? Of course they are global, and how they are global instance plus global static, right? So this is your global instance variable, right? Whereas this becomes now global static variable, right? Now, and this method is basically, this is your instance method, whereas now guys this is your static method, right? So I have, you have understood the difference. First of all, that what is the difference between instance versus static, right? So whenever a variable is instance variable, whenever a method is instance or a variable is instance variable, then whenever I'm creating objects, for each object a space will be allocated for instance variable or an instance method, right? So we saw that the common stuff, if we define as an instance variable or instance method, we are unnecessarily spending memory on the heap, right? So to avoid that, I will define the common stuff of the class as static. So I feel here that the school name will be common to all the objects, so I have defined it as static. I also feel that dress code is common to all the students, so I have defined that as a static. Now now with this structure, now if you try to create objects, the memory allocation will be a little different, right? So if you see here guys, now if I create an object, okay, so of course on your heap certain block gets created, right? So let me say here main method, and I'm gonna say here student s1 equals to new of student, like this, right? Sorry, it is student. Okay, so what will happen here? So if you notice here, so I have created a reference, I've created an object of student, and what is the reference guys? Reference is s1 here, right? Now as we discuss, whenever we create object, so on your heap a block gets created, and on this block now guys only instance variables and methods will be allocated. So if you see here, I'll be having only name, okay, and standard, like this, okay, whereas the static stuff will never be allocated on this block, and this is how we are saving the memory. So the next question is, where is the static stuff going then, right? So on your heap guys, there is a area known as permanent area, permanent allocation basically, okay. So this, the on the right hand side, this section of your heap called as permanent area, permanent allocation, or also known as methods area basically, right? So so the static stuff to a class will always reside over here basically, right? It will always reside on your permanent allocation, right? So for example, so here my something called a student, so school name, sorry, school name equals to, let's say, bishop, and I have, let's say, dress code, okay. So if you see now, so the static stuff is always stored in the permanent allocation of your heap, right? Whereas the objects whatever we create, they are always generated, they are always kept in the younger generation of your heap, right? So this part is younger generation of your heap, whereas this, the right hand side, is called as permanent allocation, right? Now so from this picture it is very clear that whenever you want to access the instance data members of a class, you need a reference. Whereas guys, whenever you want to access static stuff of the class, you can directly access that stuff with the name of class, or if you are in the same class, you can call them directly basically. you do not need a reference to call the static stuff. Meaning, if you see here, if I just say here sys out, okay, and let's say I want to print the value of the school name. So if you just say I can call this directly, right? Whereas let's say if I want to call this particular method, see I can directly call this method like this. I don't need a reference to access the static stuff here, right? Now you can access like this, or there's another way. So you can also give the reference of the class name here. Okay, so I'll just say here student dot school name. Okay, and I'll say student dot dress code basically, right? So this is how I'm trying to access static data members of the class basically. Understood? And if I want to of course access the instance data members of the class, I of course I have to create an object basically, right? So I hope you have understood what's the difference between a static versus instance now, right? Now the question, a very common question asked in an interview is that why the main method is static then? Okay, yes, can you think why the main method is static? So if you see guys, main method is always called by your JVM, right? So JVM always calls main method, right? Now, as the main method is static in nature, your JVM does not have to create object of it, right? In order to trigger, right? Since it's static, so your JVM can directly call a static method without creating a reference, right? Whereas other, if that would have been a instance method, then it would have been a headache for JVM to create the reference, create the object first, and then trigger it basically, right? So that's the reason main method is always static in nature, right? Understood? Okay. Okay. Now if you see, okay, let me close everything. So now I'm going to create another package with a name called as constructor. We're going to learn now what do you mean by constructors in Java, right? So to explain constructor, the let me create one class first, student, right? Let's say guys, this student has something called as name, right? This student also has, let's say, roll number, right? Then the student has age, right? Then it also has gender, right? Now what kind of these variables are, guys? These are global instance variable, right? Also guys, the student, let's say I want to say the behavior of the student is defined by the methods, right? Instance methods. So for example, I'll say public void, let's say print name. This is a instance method, right? Instance method. Now, and in order to access an instance method, we just discussed that we have to create an object basically, right? So I'll just say sys out, let's say name is name like this, okay? And let me say public void, let's say print roll number, right? It should be camel case, so I'll say roll number like this, okay? And just do sys out, and I'm gonna say roll number of student. Okay, I'm just doing a concat is, let's say, plus roll number like this, okay? Now if you see one thing here guys, okay, whenever I want to, whenever I create let's say object of this class, something called as like something like this, okay, like this. So whenever you create object of the class, the very first thing as you have to do is that you need to initialize the values basically, right? You have to set values for all the instance variables, right? Without setting the values, if you try to print, for example, if I try to print s1 dot name, of course it is going to print the default values, which is of no use, right? It will have either null or it will have either zeros depending on what data type the variable is, right? So the very first thing we always have to do is initialize these variables, right? So I'll have to do s1 dot name, maybe I'll set it to, let's say, Virat, right? Then I'll have to say s1 dot roll number, I'll set it to 10. Then let's say s1 dot age, let's set it to, for example, 34, right? And let's set gender as, let's say, M, right? So we have to do this assignment first. The values we will have to initialize first, right? Without which, of course, you cannot call these methods. You can call, but the output will not be meaningful, right? So for example, now if I call print name and let's say print roll number, now if you see, if I execute this program, see, now I'm getting some meaningful output, right? So let's imagine a class having, let's say, 50 such field, 50 such global instance variables. So in that case, guys, we'll have to write this 50 lines to initialize these variables, right? Which is a headache for us, right? Of course, we'll have to initialize, we'll have to just write down 15 lines of code just to initialize the variable, and then we would write down the actual calling of methods and so on and so forth. So to avoid this in Java, okay, Java has introduced something called as constructor. Okay, so constructor, guys, will always have same name as that of your class name. So student here, right? So now I've created a constructor. Let's say, and this constructor at present is not having any arguments, right? So I'm just saying no argument constructor, right? So guys, so constructor is like a method, first of all, okay, and the name of the constructor will be same as that of your class name. So if you see the class name here is student, so I've created a constructor with the same name as that of your class name. You cannot give a different name to a constructor, okay? Now whenever you create, so if you see here now, so whenever you create object of a class, basically your control will always come to the constructor first, and this code gets evaluated, okay? So if you see here, guys, when I execute this program, let me show you. See, your constructor gets triggered. So whenever you try to create an object, constructor gets triggered. So let me show you like this. So let's say I'm trying to create 4 objects, right? So whenever I create 4 objects, for every object creation, constructor gets triggered. So let me show you like this. Let me put a breakpoint over here, right? And if you see, guys, now if I execute this code, see, so first object got created. So let's say I put a breakpoint over here. Now if you see, if I do a over step in, sorry, see, it is jumping to the constructor, right? If I do step over, so the constructor gets evaluated. Remove this breakpoint. Now I'm at, let's say, second object creation. Again, if you do a step in, again it's gonna hit the constructor, right? So constructor code gets evaluated, again it will come to the line number 19. So in short, whenever you create an object, basically your constructor will be triggered, right? Now what I will do here, I will just enhance this code a little further. Okay, so let me copy the student in the same package. So I'll make the changes in that class. Okay, so now what I'm going to do here, guys, okay, now I will create another constructor. So constructors can be overloaded, right? So now if you see, I have loaded this, I have again created one more constructor with the same name, of course, but this time I'm going to say here this, I'll pass certain arguments to it. So I'll say, let's say string name, let's say integer roll number, okay, integer age, and let's say character gender, like this. Okay, now I've overloaded this constructor. Okay, and I'm gonna say here, now these are the local variables, of course, because they are defined at constructor level, so they are local, whereas these are global variables. Now I want to assign, so whenever I call, for example, so now for example I'll say student to s2 new of student to, let's say the name is, and I'm passing the arguments Amit, let's say the roll number is 10, age is 34, and gender is, let's say, male, like this. Now what happens in this case, guys, okay, so if you see here, okay, so if you see, guys, here I have two constructors, they are overloaded in nature. So whenever I execute, or whenever I write line like number 23, okay, which is a matching definition to this line, so this constructor, right, which has no arguments to it, whereas when I execute line number 24, now to this line, this is the matching constructor, right? Why? Because of course we are creating an object, and now we know that whenever we create an object, a respective constructor gets triggered, right? So if I execute this code, see, the first line for 23 line, default constructor got triggered, no argument constructor, whereas for line number 24, this argument constructor got triggered, right? But guys, how is it helping us doing the assignment that we haven't not yet done, right? Now what I'm going to do here, so basically whenever I pass these arguments, these values will be assigned or will be mapped to these arguments, right? So Amit will be mapped to name, 10 will be mapped to roll number, 34 will be mapped to age, and M will be mapped to gender, right? So now what I'm going to do here, I'll take advantage of this, right? So on the left hand side, I'll say take the global variable. So how you differentiate a global variable here? So I'll say this dot name basically. So this represents your global variable basically. This dot name, I want to assign this to the name which is in this variable, right? Then I'll say this dot roll number equals to roll number, right? Then this dot age equals to age. This dot, let's say, gender equals to gender. Now what happens in this case, guys, whenever this line gets triggered, okay, your respective constructor is called, and these values will be mapped to the constructor arguments, and I'm simply assigning these constructor argument values to the global instance variable. So this is how, guys, my assignment is done automatically, right? So if you see here, if I now simply say print here, guys, I just want to print, let's say, s2 dot name, so this will be printing Amit, because with the help of constructor now I've set the value, and now I'm printing it, right? So now if I say, let's say, I simply call the method, let's say, s2 dot print name, or s2 dot maybe print roll number. So if you see here, I can very well call these methods because I've already set the initialize the instance variable, and now I can very well call these methods. So if you see here, I get some meaningful output here. Do you see? Name is Amit, so line 26 has printed Amit. This line 27 has printed name is Amit, and line 20 has printed roll number of student Amit is 10, right? So if you see the initialization stuff we have overcome, or rather we have removed with the help of constructor basically, right? Okay, so I hope so everybody's clear with constructor, right? So I can define here, so constructors can be overloaded. So if you see, I have overloaded the constructor. Constructor will have name same as that of your class name. So if you see, my class name is student and the constructor also has name as student. Very important point, guys, constructor does not have a return type. So if you see, there is no return type here, or otherwise in the methods session, right, we talked about that a method will have a return type, void, or maybe it could be integer, double, long, so and so forth, right? Okay, all right. So I think that's it about this module 3. Okay, now, so after this video, I'll be covering module 4, okay, in the next video. All right, guys, thanks all for watching this video. Okay, have a great day.